Deficit. If you work out or like me, you only do calisthenics, you probably already heard about this term, especially when it comes to push-ups. Deficit push-ups, for example, is an exercise that you already have heard about, especially when you have clicked on this video. And I don't know if you are like me, but when I heard that term, deficit, on an exercise like a push-up, my mind crashed. I simply couldn't understand what exactly was deficit about it, you know? In this video, I will show you my case as to why there is no such thing as deficit push-ups and why using the term is wrong. But obviously, we first need to define the deficit. Deficit means a reduction of the conventional, normal, necessary, or the present quality of something. This means that when we talk about deficit, we talk about the relationship of two subjects, the necessary or normal amount of anything, plus the reduction that deficit implies. If there is no reduction, then there is no deficit. Then when we talk about deficit, we need to make sure what it is that we are talking about and if there really is a reduction of a certain quality in an exercise, which will make us call an exercise deficit. As an example, deadlifts or deficit push-ups. In deadlifts, the term deficit implies an increase in range of motion and a more difficult starting position. But these two qualities do not define the term deficit. These are the result of the actual deficit. The actual deficit, that is the reduction of something, comes from the relationship of two things, the barbell height and the height of your feet. Increasing the height of your feet results in a reduction of height between the barbell and your feet, which results in a deficit. To be more exact, a height deficit between your feet and the barbell. In a conventional deadlift, the distance between your feet and the barbell is greater than in a deficit deadlift where the distance between your feet and the barbell is lesser. Thus, we probably call the deficit deadlift deficit. The reduction of height between the feet and the barbell creates a proximity between them, which results in the weightlifter needing to overall move his body more down, either by bending more the legs or by greater hip hinge, or both. As a result of this, there is a greater range of motion and a more difficult exercise. And this is where the term deficit starts to be used incorrectly, because of the association of greater range of motion and harder exercises with the term deficit. Then it makes a bit of sense that we start naming variations of conventional exercises that have those qualities of a greater range of motion and a greater difficulty to be deficit exercises. Both a deficit push-up and a deficit deadlift have a greater range of motion and are a bit more difficult than their conventional counterparts, and require an increase of height of the feet, or in the case of the push-up, the hands. So what is exactly the problem? Because the push-up is a calisthenic exercise, meaning an exercise using gravity and our own body weight, it means that there is no external fixed weight to lift. This is really important because the whole notion of a deficit in a deficit deadlift, for example, comes from the height between the barbell and your feet. And if there is no external weight, what is exactly the relationship and reduction between qualities of an exercise that makes you call the deficit push-up a deficit? Let's assume, for example, that in this case of the push-up, we use our hands, and as a standard, instead of the barbell, we use the floor, because to do a push-up, we need a surface to do it. Then we transfer the same logical explanation of the deadlift to the push-up, and the deficit will come from the height of the floor and the height of your hands, instead of the height of the barbell and the height of your feet. In a conventional push-up, your hands and the floor are basically the same height, but as you know, in a deficit push-up, we need not only a higher surface, but something that will allow us to go deeper to allow a greater range of motion. In all cases, what we do is we simply go to a higher surface that allows our chest to go deeper like a parallel bar. In this case, when you go to a higher surface, the distance between your hands and the floor are greater than in a conventional push-up, making in fact a greater height between your hands and the floor, which in a way we could call this a surplus of the height between your hands and the floor. In no way there is a deficit of height between your hands and the floor, or a reduction of anything in this push-up. Even if both the deficit deadlift and the deficit push-up both have a greater range of motion and are a bit more difficult, the deficit deadlift has an increase of range of motion caused by a reduction of height between your feet and the barbell, while the push-up experiences an increased range of motion by the increase of height between your hands and the floor. The term deficit push-up is technically incorrect. There is no such deficit in a deficit push-ups. As an alternative that I think is more beneficial overall and easier to understand and even to hold as a name for this variation will be simply called a deep push-up, which can also be applied to the handstand push-up or any other kind of push-up. This is a case of barbell terminology going straight to calisthenics, and I think it is interesting how the fact that there is no fixed weight to live kinda changes a lot of how things work and are defined. Still, you could say that it is only a name and that there are a ridiculous amount of names in exercises. As an example, the sissy squat. What is exactly sissy about the sissy squat? There is nothing sissy about it. In fact, a proper sissy squat is way more difficult and hard than a conventional non-weighted squat. Still, even so, the word sissy has nothing technical about it, and I think it was good to go within the possible misconception of the term deficit in this case. If you think I'm wrong or I have a fault in my logic, write it in the comments.